Welcome back to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Mueller. John is standing by along with Keith Jordan. We're going to jump right in. There's a lot to get to in this next 30 minutes. So, gentlemen, our duty is always to protect women and children here on our program. Again, we're not necessarily ever against the LGBTQ community, but we do believe that the ideology that's being groomed into our children and the way that women are being treated is of concern to us first and foremost. And that's where we're going to pick up part 2 today under ourduty.group is where you can find more great information. If you're a parent or a grandparent, you're going to be able to get the information that you need, get the wording that you need, because the definitions of words have all changed as well. And well, there's a lot to get to. So let's jump right in here. Part 2, you guys are about to bring up a chart after discussing quite a bit on part 1. John, why don't you take it away from here, and let's see where this heads on part 2.
Thank you, Brad. Keith, welcome back. Let's jump right into things. On part 1, we reviewed both your Twitter page and your personal, or your organizational Twitter page and your personal page. I want to bring that up for a moment because there's probably additional things on your own personal Twitter page. You did a series of posts. I want you to highlight anything else we should know about that, because you and I had interacted with one another from afar, so to speak. But when I saw on your own page, I'm going to scroll up again, you started to post almost bullet point by bullet point. Here are some of the things that you have seen in your work with families, with kids that think they're transgender over the past 4 years. What have you learned? We kind of went through some of these, the role of social media. You talked about the dangers of gaming, and then we talked about the cult-like dynamics. Talk to us, whatever else do we need to know? Because then we're going to, pardon the pun, we're going to transition to looking at a chart, a flow chart that is on the site, Our Duty. So pick up any additional things that we need to cover from that post, that bullet point list that was absolutely excellent.
Thank you, John. The other points that I was making, and although it was largely in reference to what was going on in the UK, I think the same does apply in the United States, was the activism of teachers in schools was one of the points that I raised, together with the capture of school boards such that they're promoting inappropriate material to children, which can either prematurely sexualize them or give them the idea that they might be transgender. And in another one of those posts, I mentioned that the ideological capture of broader society was also problematic, especially government departments. If they believe that somebody can have a gender identity, and then that message is transmitted throughout the organization, making it an uncomfortable place for those of us who do not believe in gender identity. But also it reinforces and gives legitimacy to the idea that somebody can be transgender. And if that idea gets into the head of a susceptible young person, then that increases the risk that they will then go on to develop full-blown transgender ideation. So it's a whole capture of lots of different parts of society that really I was trying to drive at in that suite of tweets.
And you did an excellent job, and that's why it's so hard for people to kind of wrap their mind around both that this isn't true, right? That this is a fabrication. Gender ideology is all a fabrication, didn't exist prior to the year 2005. And, so it really it has been contrived, but then to try to figure out where is all the influence coming from? It's a multi-pronged approach. And so with, I'm going to screen share again. We're going to go to your site because your organization has put together a tremendous flow chart. So if people go to ourduty.group, so that's a website, ourduty.group. If you scroll down, you're going to see a chart that is an excellent, so you've got additional download, you've got a ton of good information on your site. So I strongly recommend parents avail themselves. You are an international group. You've got support groups in the UK and Australia, in the US. And so we're now going to look at a chart as it comes up. There we go. So Keith, talk to us about what is this chart? What are parents looking at? And walk us through it.
Okay. Right. So the very first line across the top, I'll just briefly describe what's going on here. So the boxes in blue are the path that makes a child vulnerable to falling into having a bad journey through the gender clinics.
And a lot of those are untreated mental health issues.
Indeed. And I'll come back and pick apart the susceptibility box in a minute. The red line is external forces, external forces that are driving this through. So that tweet thread that we've been talking about was talking about how much of society has been captured and how children are groomed online to believe they might be transgender. And in the round, I call that indoctrination.
Because so the blue is the internal susceptibility.
Yeah.
Then the red is the external forces or influences that are being brought to bear, and that is what that toxic combination, so to speak, that'll really start to get the ball rolling.
Indeed, absolutely. And the green column is basically what I consider the job of our duty, or parents in general, or the job that society needs to actually build up and develop for itself to replace gender ideology, is how we get our kids out of this. And the purple column in the middle under capture is basically the pipeline that the children who are susceptible and indoctrinated and are not resilient end up falling down this rabbit hole. So
and we've called this in the past, Keith, I've called it a moving sidewalk. So what you're describing, what we want parents to understand is this is a dynamic thing, almost like a Niagara River to Niagara Falls. Once a child enters in at any one of these entry points, there's going to start to become movement toward the next point.
Indeed. Susceptibility, well, what do we mean by susceptibility? And this is traits or attributes that a young person might have that might mean that they are susceptible to the indoctrination of others that are trying to tell them that they're transgender. And these susceptibilities, there's a whole list of them, which we can come to a bit further down, if you like.
You mean continuing to scroll down?
Yeah.
We are.
So,
wow. Okay.
So we're looking at prior trauma, bullying, anxiety and depression, whether a child's homosexual, if they're neurodiverse, and it can be literally anything, like even mild dyslexia. In all these items on this list, and it's not an exhaustive list, I could probably add some to it. These are all things that contribute to a child not quite fitting in at school. In other words, they become not part of the in crowds, they're out on the fringes. And I tend to call them the quirky kids. You know, they're just a little bit different. Quite often it's because they're really, really hyper creative. You know, these are the kids that go on to be the actresses, the pop stars, the artists. You know, I think it's a sad truth that this transgender craze is actually destroying a lot of the children who would actually grow up to be the great stars of the future in their own particular firmament. So susceptibility is all about what makes a child, you could call it vulnerable. Some people call these comorbidities of gender dysphoria, but I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that, in that they're not necessarily comorbidities, and I'm not really that big a fan of the phrase gender dysphoria anymore, having been in this for so long, and I can come to that later if you like.
And I think the term susceptibilities are perfect. Yeah. So if you've got a child who's susceptible and you've got all these indoctrination factors coming in, which we talked about at length in part one, but you know, the online influences, the activist teachers, wider society telling kids that they can be transgender, all these factors are coming together. And Keith, this is beautifully well put together, because I'm going to scroll back up. Everybody watch your eyes. So what's great is on your site, you have the chart, then a parent can continue to scroll down, and now you have defined for the parent or the viewer these different terms. So as we continue to scroll down, there's the indoctrination, and as you talk about resilience, and then unfortunately, and these expand, as you say, I see right there, read more. So this is really a very comprehensive list.
Yep, it's growing all the time. You know, some of the read mores are not as complete as we'd like. Some are missing, but you know, it's being added to all the time. I'm going to scroll back up to the chart. Everybody watch your eyes for a second, right? So okay, there we are. So if you've got a susceptible child who is indoctrinated and they're not resilient, okay, and by resilient we mean that in a way they've almost been pre-programmed to say, yeah, that's a load of rubbish, that gender stuff, I'm not having anything to do with it, of course I'm not transgender, and it's okay with me being slightly different. You know, it's okay for a girl to be a tomboy, it's okay for a boy to be a bit effeminate, it's okay for any child to be dyslexic or have ADHD, you know, just because it makes them a little bit different from, you know, the vast majority of the other kids in class. It's okay. But if they haven't got that resilience, then they're likely to start thinking of themselves as potentially being transgender, and we call this transgender ideation. So they get the ideas in their head, and you know, as I said before, society is feeding them full of this rubbish online, and you know, even as I say, Google search engines will throw up stuff that gives children the wrong ideas. And if they've got anxiety and depression particularly, they're going to be prone to ruminating on these ideas. You know, they're going to be locking themselves in their room for hours and hours on end thinking, oh, I must be transgender because I don't look particularly pretty, or I don't look particularly macho.
And that's why these teens are so susceptible, because adolescence is a horrible time for teens. And the last thing they need are these messages to come across saying, well, you feel badly about you feel poorly about yourself, don't you? You don't feel comfortable in your own skin, kind of thing. And so now they introduce these ideas.
They do, yeah, absolutely. You know, it's a perfect storm, isn't it? Because, you know, kids have got all these hormones raging through the body as they're going through puberty. They're changing. They're actually feeling awkward because their bones are growing at such a large rate. They're going through that period of adolescent development where they're actually trying. Nature is telling them to do some identity formation, and that identity formation is actually being hijacked by the TQ mob promoting the idea that they're going to be transgender.
That's right. And so kids are trying to become their own individual, so individuation, but then we also have that peer they desperately want to fit in. And so that challenge, they are ripe for some manipulator. I call them, to the extreme, you have perpetrators, but it really exploiting these kids. Now, that term oftentimes is connoted with sexual exploitation, but anytime you take advantage of someone, you are exploiting them. And so you have forces then within the transgender movement, those that are pushing this. You have individuals, you have organizations that have profit motive, and then you have those that have deviant sexual motives, that they're going to use these kids. So the ones that are pushing these are agenda driven. And in the UK, you all have been, you're sort of the canary in the mine shaft. Also Ireland, you all have been hit so hard with this entire movement. And then of course now it's in Canada. It certainly is in Australia, New Zealand, and now in the US with the Biden administration, of course.
Yeah, I think the complicity of politicians, and we as an organisation, our duty does not discriminate on what parents we support. So we've got Republicans, Democrats, Labour voters, Conservative voters, probably communists. We don't really ask people about their politics.
That's right.
And we've got people, we've got Muslims, Hindus, Christians, atheists, you name it. We'll take any parent who is struggling to cope with this. And what we've learned is that, those parents that are historically themselves and their families been on the left, they're completely perplexed as to why it is their parties, because it does tend to be the parties on the left, Trudeau and Biden and Jacinda Ardern, who are promoting this more than the parties on the right. But it's one thing we've noticed, that no individual party grouping is immune from this. They've all been captured in some way. They've all got believers in the gender cult amongst their number. I digress. But I was just making a general point that.
So Keith, ourduty.group is the place to go for your website. On that website, can you tell us? There's a lot happening in Canada and the U.S. You're in the UK. So in the UK, what I want to know is, has there been anything in the way of really criminality to any of this? Has there been any kind of a criminal situation brought in? There's coercion, extortion, intimidation. Those are some of the criminality words. Is there anything happening that way?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Brad, because we believe very strongly that our children have been harmed. Especially those who've been medicalised unnecessarily or have received unethical surgeries. And we're very much of the opinion that criminal charges should be brought against the perpetrators of these crimes against the person. However, we've got a bit of a challenge because, as previously mentioned, so much of society is captured by this ideology. It's difficult to get the police to take this seriously. And in the United Kingdom, the way that crimes are prosecuted is as a centralised prosecution service. And I know that's different in the US and it's different in other jurisdictions, but in the UK, it's a centralised prosecution service called the Crown Prosecution Service, and they have been ideologically captured. So even if you try and nudge them to say, will you prosecute this unethical surgeon for cutting this boy's penis off, it's unlikely to happen in the current climate. So there's a lot of political persuasion that needs to happen beforehand in order for us to get to the point where the police are actually treating these crimes as crimes, and where the Crown Prosecution Service is then willing to take them up and take them to court to prosecute those who have been harming our children.
Well, it's pretty tough to stay any kind of charges against a doctor. They're protected all the way around. They've got document after document that the patient has signed and filled out, and they're kind of covering their own asses in a sense. But there's no coming back with these kids, right? And that's the real issue.
Yeah, I mean, now to pick up on your point, one of the problems we've got is there's an organisation called WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health.
We have featured WPATH a number of times. That's right.
And because of they have been publishing something which they call standards of care, but aren't really standards of care, as I'm sure you've covered previously. Mm-hmm. And the trouble is, what we have to do is get the governing bodies for the surgeons and other doctors in the countries where this problem's happening to refuse to accept the WPATH interpretation of how these children should be treated as being accepted medical practice. Because as soon as the governing bodies of all the medics say, no, this is not the done thing, then those people that are doing it lose the medical defence, which they would naturally try to use to defend themselves against any criminal liability.
Right.
Just for those people, those parents that may not know, WPATH is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health Specialists, and it's an activist group. You have tremendous medical professionals. We've had Dr. Cotella, we've had Dr. Von Mall. You have leading endocrinologists here in the U.S. and abroad that are trying to help people understand that there's never a reason why you want to fool around with opposite sex hormones. This is experimental medical practice. It's medical malpractice. Yet this advocacy group, headed up by Marcy Bowers, who's the guy that appears to be a woman who did Jazz Jennings surgery. Matt Walsh did a documentary called What is a Woman? Marcy Bowers. Dr. Bowers is interviewed in that. Dr. Bowers is the one that joked as she was taking a photograph of Jazz Jennings post-surgery, saying, you've had so many photographs, you could be a porn star. That should concern all of us. Right? So this WPATH organization is, in my estimation, the worst of advocacy groups, including now they're starting to advocate for the eunuch, adopting a eunuch persona, which means you're going to castrate kids, and it happens to be boys, and the very deviant things are happening with that. So WPATH is an organization that is anything but ethical.
Oh, indeed. I was wondering, I don't think we've got much time left, so could we just go back to that chart and we could just finish it off? Is that okay?
By all means, let me bring that up right now. So again, it's on your website, ourduty.group homepage, and scroll down, and here's the chart again.
Oh, yeah, thank you, John. A couple of things I wanted to pick up on was the idea of gender dysphoria. That's defined in the DSM, which is a list of psychiatric conditions. And it really is, gender dysphoria is really just defined as a list of feelings. So it's very, very hard. There is no actual testable diagnosis for gender dysphoria. It's basically, how do you feel?
It is crucial, by the way, because I've made the case. The DSM-4 had a different diagnosis. That was gender identity disorder, primarily in young kids, and then they shifted to teens. You could see that there's the DSM-4 TR, and those of us in the field, I saw this starting to happen. So the DSM-5, published in 2013, they changed gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. With that change, made all the billing possible. They made this profitable.
Yeah, I'm sure that was part of it. Especially those jurisdictions where they've got insurance-led healthcare, it made it easier for the insurers to pay for these treatments. Briefly going through, obviously then, once somebody's been thinking about this for too long, they had the idea in their head, they ruminate on it, they might have genuinely some of these feelings on the list of gender dysphoria, and at which point they're then going to start saying, I am transgender. That's when they adopt a transgender identity. They'll tell their parents perhaps that they're non-binary or that they're the opposite sex. And beyond that is what we call social affirmation, which is when they get everybody else to agree with them. So in a way, they're trying to tell other people to use their new name, to use the wrong sex pronouns for them, and so on and so forth. And this is part of the problem with transgender ideation is that once it turns into transgender identity, it can only survive with external validation. You know, because every single person who claims to be transgender knows what their sex is. You know, so they need the validation to come externally. Fake gender dysphoria is basically when they know this list of feelings that they're meant to have. They don't actually have them, but they've been told by their indoctrinators to pretend to have that list of feelings when they go to the doctor so that they will get the hormones. Okay, and we've known about this for 4 or 5 years that's been going on. So they're actually coached to pretend they've got gender dysphoria. They might not actually have it, and they still get on this medical pathway. And there's a whole conversation to be had about this movement to depathologize gender dysphoria and how it's almost like got all these logical inconsistencies with it. But that would be for a completely separate discussion. And then, the final step in the process is when they actually then do get given these ghastly treatments by the medical profession, the puberty blockers, the cross-sex hormones, the surgeries. And once somebody has gone down that route, then we call people who realise they've made a mistake and have to stop it and try and unwind, which of course they can't do because the harm is irreversible. We call those detransitioners, so the process is called detransition. So our work with our duty, really, because parents have already got a child who's got transgender ideation, our work is really about how do we engineer desistance? How do we engineer the family to help the child stop thinking of themselves as transgender? So the work that goes on in our support groups is very much geared to helping parents navigate their way. As I said, our job is the green bit on that table. How do we help them get to systems?
Really deprogramming. Because if you have unduly influenced someone, the old-fashioned term used to be brainwashing. So if you've taken susceptible kids and you have brought undue influence from the outside in, now you have unduly influenced, and so it only is right that if a kid had their thinking and their emotions all screwed up now, that they have somebody who can help them think clearly, lest they go over the Niagara Falls of the medical transition to irreversible damage.
Indeed. And the worst thing is that, if we encourage legitimate deprogramming for these children, we're accused of being the bad guys because the TQ crowd call that conversion therapy. And
they've toyed with the language. They've cults that. So, and I know in Canada, it's just run rampant, Brad. That started to impact your family. That's why you do this. I, as a therapist, I feel compelled because I know this is a grand scheme. And so we're all here, Keith. You've been impacted by this. We hope that parents really go to your site and use the resources. There are support groups. How do they reach you? Or is there contact right there on your site, Keith?
Yeah, there's a button to press called register on the website, and if parents click through that, they'll have a form to fill in. And once they fill that form in, there's an automated process that will send emails, and they'll put them in touch with their local chapter, and then they'll get the chance to speak to somebody near to where they are in the world, and take it from there.
Keith, thank you. Thank you for all you do. Thank you for what you are doing. Thank you for Our Duty, your organization, and thank you for being our guest. It's been extremely informative.
Thank you very much for having me, John.
Well, there's a lot of thank yous there at the end of every episode, and thank you to both of you for being here today. I'm Brad Wilder. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. Please make sure you see us online at our website, unmaskingthetransmovement.com. You can find us on Rumble, BitChute, and on YouTube as well until they try to take us down. I'm Brad Wilder. I'll see you next time.
Join Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler Sunday, August 17th at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as he hosts Unmasking the Trans Movement's free support group with special guest Tracy Shannon, trans widow. We connect you with those who have experience, connection, and understanding on the many topics that make up this disturbing ideology and answer any questions you may have. Protecting the most vulnerable, women and children. Unmasking the Trans Movement. For more info on guests, dates, and times, see us online at unmaskingthetransmovement.com.